Community instructions. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus talks about relationships within the community of the church. And largely here he talks about, there's even a parable in there of the unjust, unmerciful servant who borrowed from this guy billions of dollars, and he goes to the guy, please forgive me my billions of dollars that I owe you. And the big master says, okay, I forgive you. And then the guy goes home and the guy owes him $10. And the guy has this guy thrown in prison. And the master then comes back and says, you owed me billions and I forgave you. You won't forgive that guy $10? And so the master then has some major problems with the guy. But this community instructions also, it talks about when there's conflict in the community of the church. When there's conflict in the community of the church. Matthew is one of the only Gospels, by the way, that mentions the word ecclesia, or church. And so when there's a conflict in the church, what do? You got a conflict with somebody in the church. What do? Well, of course, you go gossip, right? No, Jesus didn't say that. So you got two people that got a problem in the church. What do? You go to the person first. You go to the person first. You confront the person and say, okay, this is the problem, and you try to work out the problem one-on-one between the two. By the way, I always tell my class this too. I used to work with a guy, he was a business guy, Anthony, and I kept telling him, whenever you do an email, never send negative stuff in an email. Never send negative stuff in an email. And basically, if you've got something negative to say to somebody, you should go what? You should go face-to-face to them. So if I've got some problem here at Gordon College or whatever, if I've got a problem with the provost or the dean or whoever, I'm going to go to that person directly and talk to them and say, I got a problem with this directly. I'm not going to put it in an email. I'm not going to get on a telephone and, hey, this is my problem. I'm going to go to them personally and talk to them and just explain my problem and what it is, and we'll talk about it and things. And so, one-on-one, you go to try to solve the problem. If the problem is not resolved between the two of you, then basically you take 2 or 3 people with you and you go 3 to the 1, and you basically come together with a couple witnesses and basically have other people who may be able to help with their wisdom solve the problem. So you take 2 or 3 people and you go back and you try to solve the problem. If the person still will not resolve and reconcile the situation, you take it before the church. And the church is, composed of the elders, deacons, or, however your church is composed, and you take it to the church and the people in the church, and basically if the person doesn't listen to the church and there's still no reconciliation, then basically the person can be kicked out of the church, and excommunication, that kind of thing. So there's this process, 1-on-1, 2 or 3 on 1, trying to reconcile, whole church to 1, trying to reconcile. If it won't be reconciled, then at that point the person is kicked out of the church, excommunication or thereabouts. So this is just, Jesus gives some community instructions here. It's a great passage. If you're ever involved in churches and small groups and things, this is how things should be done according to the words of Christ. The last discourse is the Olivet Discourse. This is the message that Jesus gave on the Mount of Olives. Okay, Mount of Olives, just where the Garden of Gethsemane is. Some of you have used the Get Lost in Jerusalem program. And up on the Mount of Olives, Jesus is going to a lot of time on the Mount of Olives. Jesus, by the way, went up from the Mount of Olives in the book of Acts. He ascends to heaven from the Mount of Olives. And apparently, from the Old Testament, we know he's going to come back to the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is going to split open. So the Mount of Olives, a real famous place, is just to the east of Jerusalem. So if Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, is here, you go down in the Kidron Valley, you come up, there's a high mountain here, it's about 2,700 feet high. This is the Mount of Olives, and it's to the east. Once you go over the Mount of Olives, you're out into the desert. So on the far side, the eastern side of the Mount of Olives, it's all desert. But the Mount of Olives is here, and there's all these olive groves. That's why they call it olives. They do a lot with olives over there. I'm not a real big olive person myself, but they squeeze the olives and make olive oil out of it. And whenever you see oil, by the way, in the Bible, I couldn't believe it years ago. There was this prophecy speaker who came into our church, and he was saying about how they found oil in Israel. And he was saying the oil references in some of the passages about Asher, and the references in Genesis 49 where the Asher dips his foot in oil. And he was saying that's off the coast of Israel they're going to find all this big oil stuff. And he's talking about petroleum oil. No, I'm sorry. Anybody knows that's read the Old Testament and New Testament. Whenever it mentions oil, shemen, it's talking about olive oil. They do everything with olive oil. They cook with it. They anoint their bodies with it. By the way, when you say the Mashiach, you guys call him the Messiah. The Messiah is the anointed one. You anoint with olive oil. You anoint with olive oil. And so the anointed one, they anointed their kings, they anointed their priests, they anointed their prophets. They anointed them with oil. They were Mashiached. They were anointed ones. In the New Testament, by the way, that Mashiach, that oiled one, olive oil one that they're anointed, comes over as the word Christos. So Christos means in Greek, anointed one. Mashiach in Hebrew means anointed one. So it's Jesus, Jesus, Christos. Christos means anointed one. So Jesus, the Christos, the anointed one. And so anyways, it's olive oil. And so what you have is the Mount of Olives then, where a lot of these trees are grown to the east of Jerusalem there on the other side of across the Kidron Valley. And this is the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25. This is what talks a lot about the future. So the Olivet Discourse is absolutely critical for how one views the future. And he talks about the judgment day coming with the parable of the sheep and the goats. And, so much as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. He talks about the 10 bridesmaids, 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. And basically, while the foolish ones are off running to get their oil and things for their lamps, the master comes and 5 are accepted in and the other 5 are rejected and stuff. So you've got then the talents, a person's given 10 talents, they multiply. 5 talents, he multiplies. Guy's given 1 talent, he buries it in the ground, and the master's really upset with him and throws him out. And so you get these various teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Olivet Discourse about the future and the coming kingdom. And so that's, but the point of this slide then is that Matthew, the whole book of Matthew is built around these 5 discourses. And these 5 discourses portray Jesus as the new Moses, the new Pentateuch, so to speak, and the new. So this is how the book of Matthew is actually structured. These are big things there. Now, it's interesting that in each of these discourses, when it stops, it ends up with this phrase, when Jesus had finished his da-da-da-da, and it goes on, when Jesus had finished this, and when Jesus had finished that. It's almost, to be honest, it's very similar to the book of Genesis. You remember in Genesis, some of you that had Old Testament with me, the Toledot statements in the book of Genesis. This is the account of Adam's line. This is the account of Noah's line. This is the account of Shem's line. And 10 of this is the account of, that break up the book of Genesis. This is the account of this person, that person, and there's 10 of these that break up the book of Genesis, Toledots. Here, you get these statements when Jesus finished, and that's like, okay, this is the end of this part, and he moves on to the next. And then when Jesus finished, and then he ends up, and so you see, in the end of chapter 7, the end of the Sermon on the Mount, boom, there's a concluding telos, or finish. In chapter 11, verse 1, he finishes the sending of the 12. And so in 11:1, that story ends. And in chapter 13, verse 53, at the end of the parables of the kingdom, again, when Jesus had finished. And then he goes on and things. So that's an interesting kind of closing statement that Matthew uses to close off his discourse sections there, when Jesus had finished kind of thing. And it goes on, all of them basically end that way.